So for this panel, which is going to be moderated by Bill Wirtz, I think you should all listen in as best you can and take notes where possible, as it's going to be moving, it's going to be empowering, and hopefully it's going to give you something to go away from this panel with, something from this conference with, rather, to talk about when you go back to your respective countries. We'll get a bit more fun as the day goes through, but for now, this is going to be a serious discussion, and with that, I'm going to welcome to the stage Bill Wirtz, a podcaster, journalist, and writer, whose podcast is called Consumer, spelt with EU. Welcome, Bill, to the stage, please. Following Bill, we have Stella Assange, the human rights lawyer, and of course, the wife of Julian Assange. Please welcome Stella to the stage. Big round of applause for Stella, please. Yes. Arsh Molu, the Human Rights Foundation, up next. Come on down, Arsh. Keep the applause going, please, ladies and gentlemen. And last but by no means least, Lyudmyla Kozlovska. Come on down, Lyudmyla, the president of the Open Dialogue Foundation. Have a fantastic panel, ladies and gents. And please do listen in.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Prague, for having me back here to moderate this fantastic panel. You may remember me from last year for mispronouncing everyone's name. So, Matthias, this is on you. To a lot of people outside of the walls of this magnificent expo, Bitcoin is sometimes seen as nothing but an investment opportunity or a toy for people who are a bit too much into computers. But actually, the value of Bitcoin expands way beyond that. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Bitcoin as a tool for freedom, as a tool for human rights activists, as a tool for dissidents. And I'm here joined by a wonderful panel to discuss this. Before we get into that, I have to start with you, Stella, on just briefly on some of the newsworthiness of your husband, Julian Assange, being able to appeal extradition. Can you just give us a brief overview on what this means for the case so we can get through the news there?
Yeah, so as I'm sure most of you know, my husband, Julian Assange, who's the founder and publisher of WikiLeaks, has been persecuted since 2010, ever since WikiLeaks started publishing the information evidencing war crimes and so on in the Middle East and around the war on terror. And that persecution has manifested in many different ways, one involving financial services, which we'll get to. But the legal case against him is a criminal case involving 18 charges in the United States amounting to 175 years, which criminalized journalism. And over the past 5 years, he's been in a high-security prison in London, fighting extradition. And just a couple of days ago, we got the news that he will be able to bring his appeal to the High Court in London, which is really important. And it is, yeah. It's been a massive fight till this point, and it's key that the single issue that he's going to be arguing at the High Court is his access to the First Amendment. It's purely a First Amendment argument. And for years, there has been an attempt to divert, draw attention away from the fact that this is a First Amendment case. It's about freedom of information, about informing the public, and about democratizing knowledge. So.
Well, thank you for that, and I want to move the conversation to Bitcoin. And thank you for that update there. Julian Assange has said that Bitcoin is the most interesting intellectual development on the internet in the last 5 years, and he said that in 2014, so that dates back to Bitcoin's inception. What role has Bitcoin played in his work since 2010?
Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this today is the 13-year anniversary of WikiLeaks accepting Bitcoin.
On the day today?
14th of June, wow. 2011. So I think for those of you who are not too familiar with the backstory, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian, has just posted a thread about why Julian is a Bitcoin legend. And he goes through the timeline, but basically Bitcoin saved WikiLeaks and enabled WikiLeaks to be able to continue publishing when the attack started. And the attack started on many different fronts, but the financial services were, it was the first time that it was actually a blockade against an organization. WikiLeaks had just started publishing 250, well, hundreds of thousands of US documents, and there were all sorts of attempts to shut it down, and one of them was to stop donations from coming in, because WikiLeaks is funded by donations. The average donation was about $25. And so Bank of America, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, etc., all came together to shut down the donations to WikiLeaks just as the counterattack started ramping up. And this was December 2010. And WikiLeaks started receiving donations June 2011. And of course, right at the beginning, there were discussions internally, I think in the kind of Bitcoin developers, about whether WikiLeaks could maybe use Bitcoin. And Satoshi said, it's too early, you know, it's not ready. But 6 months or 7 months later, Bitcoin was ripe for use. And I think WikiLeaks really gave Bitcoin its first massive use case. And it not only shows you know, the value of Bitcoin in enabling resistance, but I think continues to show what it can achieve. I mean, really, like, the success of WikiLeaks cannot be separated from Bitcoin.
I like the perspective on enabling resistance, and I want to bring this to you, Lyudmyla. Bitcoin as a tool against political oppression. This is something you talk about a lot. And now that, with the geopolitics moving, the people in protesting in Georgia, authoritarian governments in Russia, and increasingly so in Hungary, what role does Bitcoin play for civil society organizations that are increasingly asked to be more transparent about their funding? Where does the funding come from? That's also a big topic right now in the Republic of Georgia. So can you just lay that out for us? Like, what role can Bitcoin play for human rights organizations, for political dissidents?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, first of all, to all of you developers who enabling us as civil society not only to survive, to resist and defend freedoms in the world where majority of the country are authoritarian. It is really important to understand that we right now live in a bubble here in Europe, but it's just a small piece of the world. And Bitcoin plays a key role for every single activist who financially excluded. Majority of us financially excluded, not only us, family members, our friends, our lawyers, doctors. We cannot rent an apartment. And this is actually the consequences of so-called recommendation of financial action task forces. And what we see in Georgia, what we see in Russia and many other countries, it's abuse of financial action task forces recommendation. And Bitcoin is the only, for the moment, tool. We only can use peer-to-peer transaction. This is the reason why a lot of activists actually right now using only this technology. We have no access to exchanges, and for simple reason. Our data weaponized both is financial institutions like bank, but also by crypto asset services providers, which regulated in the same way, starting from US, EU, and going after to other jurisdictions. And this is a huge, huge problem. And what actually Stella said, and actually you, Bill, mentioned, crowdfunding right now is the only main source for many authoritarian states, and majority, again, I underline, majority states are authoritarian. The only way how you can actually continue your human rights or oppositional work. And what we see, every single platform, deplatform everyone who is trying to campaign for freedom. Everyone is deplatform who is campaigning or doing humanitarian support. And again, what instrument we have? Bitcoin. But at the same time, we see majority of democracies using false narrative against Bitcoin, especially peer-to-peer transactions. And this is the reason why we, as end users, has to join our forces with every single developer, every single investor, everyone who actually understands the value of freedom of finance and actually freedom of transactions, privacy of our instruments, connection, communication, and payment. Without it, we're going to end up in China world. And it's not just something abstract. We live in the world where every single corner with a camera Police, it's just not just one function, it's a function of all financial institutions. It shouldn't be like this. IML shouldn't be a tool for repress. It was created to resist against oligarch dirty money, but in fact, right now, it's the main tool against every single oppositionist or activist all over the world. And it's not only a matter of authoritarian regime being able to do it on their domestically land, they're doing it transnationally. My personal experience, 3 authoritarian regimes at least weaponized my banking data in the very heart of Europe. So it's not abstract, it's not only my case. Every single of you can be a victim of it. And we have to protect it. And Bitcoin is actually a tool for protection.
So a lot there on financial freedom, and I want to bring this to Arsh as well. At the Human Rights Foundation, you focus on financial freedom. And I'm sure you can speak to some of the points that Lyudmyla mentioned here. And something I also would like to hear your thoughts on is that we heard now on Bitcoin as a tool in countries where the options are severely limited. You can speak to that, but also do mention what about places where there is a variety of choices? Where do organizations come down there on the sort of the reputational implications, for instance, of using Bitcoin, having a Bitcoin donation option for a major nonprofit? Where are we there? How common is that, and what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I'd like to start with the definition of financial freedom. I think this is a mixed definition for people all over the world. At least how the Human Rights Foundation and many people in the Bitcoin community classify financial freedom as is the ability to transact and invest without the crackdown of dissent from authoritarian governments. I think the usage of NGOs is huge. I mean, even organizations, like WikiLeaks, the Human Rights Foundation, we produce a conference, a yearly human rights conference called the Oslo Freedom Forum, where Assange actually spoke in 2010. And just a short year later, he posted a Bitcoin address to WikiLeaks. And as Stella mentioned, that was one of the larger use cases. And it's actually quite thrilling to see the crowd of developers and activists and enthusiasts with us, because it's become something so much more widespread. There are so many NGOs using Bitcoin right now, a majority of which are smaller to mid-size, but there are some even larger NGOs using Bitcoin, but they're just using it for, they're categorizing it rather as something that's more admin, something just banking. They're not actually getting behind it and being enthusiastic about it because of political indifferences, etc. But there are NGOs, including HRF. We've been accepting Bitcoin and using Bitcoin for grant giving and payments for about 10 years now as well. And there's Navalny's foundation, the Anti-Corruption Foundation. They're paying the salaries of hundreds of employees and dozens of offices all around the world. And there's plenty of examples, and we'll get into this later as well, of people just having to use Bitcoin because they have to.
I do want to address this, and I saw your hand, Lyudmyla, but I also want to do the practical use cases of actually paying salaries and so on. Maybe Stella on this topic. When you receive the donations in Bitcoin, is there a logistics implication where it sometimes becomes a bit difficult to manage that and actually have a practical use case of all those funds you might have in Bitcoin, but then you have other things to buy necessarily that you can't necessarily do that in Bitcoin. Is that a logistical problem there for you, or?
Well, I personally was not involved in that. I know that for several years, WikiLeaks basically had been cut off from donations, and then eventually, and it was only Bitcoin that was keeping it afloat.
So there were no bank accounts, no PayPal. There was essentially it was all.
It was all, and at the time, so this is 2010. PayPal basically had a monopoly over the, electronic donations and so on. But it was only after an organization in the US called the Freedom of the Press Foundation started accepting donations and had structured it in a way that was viable that it could start accepting fiat donations as well. But for a long time, it became very, very difficult, but WikiLeaks pulled through.
Right. Lyudmyla, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, I want to say that right now, crowdfunding or any kind of fundraising activity is one of the most difficult things, and Bitcoin is the only instrument which left for civil society, especially in authoritarian states. I will just bring one example on Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. You could not actually fundraise any single dollar for any support for families of political prisoners. Your bank account is going to be terminated or frozen within a minute. And this is the reality. Or those who donate you, and we speak about donations $1 to $5, right? It's going to be immediately send this data to security services. So all of these people are going to, again, financially excluded as financing extremist activity, because human rights defense and any kind of freedoms, it's extremist activities in authoritarian states. So in this situation, Bitcoin is the only tool. But we see obstacles. With going attacks in democracies against peer-to-peer transactions, such countries like Nigeria, such countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, they started to call peer-to-peer transaction as a tool for money launderers. So they're going after those brokers who actually helping transact or change money from Bitcoin to fiat. And right now, of course, we still need to pay for lawyers or to buy food, clothes and other stuff, pay for rent in fiat, right? So to be realistic, it's a huge obstacle. And for this reason, we defend, of course, peer-to-peer transactions and self-hosted wallets in democracies. We believe that it's super important to do this work.
And because I have you on that topic already, because at BTC Prague we want to define actionable items that we can do ourselves. So how do we support developers in that space? Because you are engaged yourself in that advocacy, also including with lawmakers on this topic. What can other people in the audience do?
Join our Building True Change coalition, which unites developers, Bitcoin miners, activists all over the world. We bring testimonials of those who financially excluded. We bring testimonials of Bitcoin miners, why it's actually Bitcoin good for energy security, why it shouldn't be banned in Norway, Iceland, or anywhere in EU, just like Bitcoiners doing in US. Look how they are successful in their attempt to educate regulators and policymakers. The same we have to do with self-hosted wallets. But we need to unite our forces, because if we don't defend technology, then it's going to be first attack on developers. So we need to go together with investors, with Bitcoin miners, with human rights defenders, and those who develop wallets to regulators and explain them the value, social value and benefits, especially for countries where no other instruments. We need to expose how travel rule is actually abused by dictators. And this is work with what we do, but we cannot do it just alone as activists. We need support of industry. Right? Just 2 days ago, we've been in Czech Parliament meeting with quite high-level politician, and when we explained him the issue of weaponization of banking data, his reaction was shocking. Like he was, okay, so next time, because your banking data in Belgium was so easily weaponized by 3 authoritarian regimes, it means that me, as a person who's actually working against Russian oligarchs, exposing corruption, one election actually makes me opposition leader, and my banking data is going to be the same weaponized. We need to have remedies. So, of course, there are those who, from politicians, have agenda, and they have in a purpose attack freedom instrument and freedom technology like Bitcoin. But we will definitely find our allies, and we have to do these efforts, just like Bitcoiners doing it in the US.
And I think with a lot of people, including lawmakers specifically, having those specific examples of bypassing financial censorship are important. Arsh, practical examples are usually what people take away from these kind of conferences, like specific examples that people can remember. Do you have something where you say, okay, this is an example I like to bring up in my advocacy of this is how Bitcoin is used to bypass financial censorship?
Yeah, I mean, I think over the past decade, when we've been seeing these use cases sprout, some of the more recent ones that I can remember off the top of my head is, in Iran right now, the government is using surveillance and AI to basically auto-fine women who are wearing their hijab improperly. The Modi regime in India has effectively blocked the bank account of the largest opposition group in India. In Belarus, Lukashenko has effectively had absolute control of the banking infrastructure, so where political prisoners and dissidents are not able to send and receive money last month marks the 1,000-day anniversary of the Taliban taking over Afghanistan. And this means that girls are not able to have education. So we work with organizations that are funding underground education in Afghanistan using Bitcoin. And education in and of itself is a human right, and Bitcoin sort of enables that right now. And I think one thing to take away from this is that I don't think it matters your politics, if you're on the left or the right, if you're progressive or libertarian. People need this thing. People are using it all over the world as sort of a currency of last resort. And when we're talking to NGOs and when we're talking to activists all over the world who are using it, they're not obsessed with the idea of the perceived culture around Bitcoin. They're not obsessed with 21 million or Keynesian economics or being a carnivore, for example, right? They use it because they need it. They don't they're not particularly obsessed with the ideals around it, but it works. So it doesn't matter your politics around it.
I find that fascinating because that is so interesting in a time when everything becomes so political that Bitcoin has resisted being put in one camp or the other in that sense, by virtue of being a tool. I think just politically, even in the audience, people would have very different views on the world. And interestingly, this is true for people who support Julian as well, because there's a wide political spectrum in that sense as well. Do you see the similarities of there's a principle behind it, there's a principle behind the Bitcoin use case, and there's also the principle behind the First Amendment and being able to do your work as a journalist? I think there's some overlap here. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and I think, like with Bitcoin, what you find with WikiLeaks in Julian's case is that you have allies from, and it's quite rare, from across the political spectrum with very different interests who disagree on many, many different things. But this really goes down to the fundamentals, and I think what we're all talking about is, it's not just why developers should care about what happens to activists. I think what happens to activists provides the broader threat model that everyone else is up against, and understanding that threat model and how what tools are needed to overcome them. And I think that's why WikiLeaks and its survival is a really important case to understand the use of various jurisdictions. And of course, it's not just the financial attack on WikiLeaks. It's had to face up to many, reputational, political, etc., and had to move with the broader geopolitical situation. As you know, Julian, for example, he sought political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy at a time when Ecuador had a government that was resisting US influence, but then there was a change, and that's why he got thrown out of the embassy. But obviously, in terms of survival, organizations obviously don't necessarily have the know-how or the, let's say, knowledge capital to survive the way WikiLeaks did. But I think there's a really important case to understand for everyone in this room, because the regulation around, or the attempts to regulate, Bitcoin, they come out of this same push for censorship that WikiLeaks has been up against, and obviously that's broadened out over time.
And on that politicization, Lyudmyla, I wanted to get you in on this. Do you see a trend where, I know an Elizabeth Warren has strong views on Bitcoin, and that's why a specific side on the political aisle in the US, for instance, would say, well, we have to get stronger on regulation. Is there this tendency, or in the political spectrum, is there just, as you often point out, maybe an absence of knowledge, and that's why a lot of regulation comes from, well, you have the authoritarian side of things, which has specific interest in regulating, and what does it look like in Europe and the rest of the Western world? Like, where's the input? Is there political motivation behind it, or what does it look like?
So definitely right now we see actors who promote attack against privacy payment instruments, actually encryption and so on. So we see these trends. You cannot deny it. I think everyone just who watch news and see what's discussed in the EU in Parliament with the protection against child abuse and so on, you see this trend. But at the same time, it's about us who represent constituency for people whom we elect to the parliament, who we elect to Senate in US and so on. It's about us to answer the question whom we going to vote and what questions we going to ask. It's first thing. The second thing, that majority of parliamentarians, because we work first of all with them, they are not aware about freedom technology. They don't know what benefits provide Bitcoin mining. They always ask us, why you guys the first who come in and saying about the things? Why no one came? Why there is no voice? Like in Norway, literally, where right now is a regulatory attack and actually attempt to ban Bitcoin mining, there was direct question, why no one from Bitcoin community coming to us? No one tried to explain it. And this is answer we have to answer, right? And we have to address, because there is reasonable, from other sides, also questions, and they need to be answered. There should be dialogue. And if we do this dialogue, we saw, for example, last year, majority of European Parliament supported our amendments promoting, for example, crypto assets as a payment and fundraising instrument, protection privacy data, and so on. But last year, after that, we were speaking there at in this room, and I was asking, guys, please go to politicians, support their efforts to defend privacy instrument, privacy payment instrument, Bitcoin. Who did it? Who did it? Just raise your hand in this room. I'm sorry, I'm pretty sure that almost no one. I'm not judging, I'm just stating as a fact. And as a result, this year, in April, we lost all our amendments, what we as human rights defenders achieved last year. So we're going to have one of the most restrictive in the world right now anti-money laundering countries regulation. And it's not only politicians' responsibility, it's our responsibility, because no one supported these politicians who were on the side of privacy payment instruments. Just do this work, because US Bitcoiners doing it, and look, they are successful. No one is trying to challenge this, unfortunately, very negative, false narrative against Bitcoin here in Europe. We have to do our homework.
So your message essentially to Bitcoiners is you have to get more interested in politics?
My message is be open-minded and talk to all your friends. If you do meet up, talk about what consequences regulation is bringing, how we can address it, go to politicians, ask these questions. Have this open dialogue. You may not like all of them. I'm not asking like them. Ask them questions, hold them accountable.
I'm asking because to some people it's the idea that Bitcoin is the way that out of politics. I don't have to be interested in anymore. Like I can exit that prism. I don't have to convince a lawmaker anymore of a specific
work like this. You say it doesn't work. Developers afterwards are going to suffer. We have this freedom technology because we enjoy these freedoms. You cannot develop freedom technology in authoritarian states. We would not be able to handle this discussion. All of us would be immediately in prison. This is simple as it is. But if we don't defend our rights, we're going to lose them. And this is what's happening. Because we don't care about privacy in EU, we're losing it. If US is caring about privacy, they defend it and they enjoy it. You know?
I wanted to, unless somebody wanted to jump in, I wanted to get Arsh on a different topic, which is the generational use on Bitcoin. I think if you can make a general statement that the average strong Bitcoiner would be sort of in the millennial generation, on average. What about Gen Z? Because you do also work with people in Gen Z on these issues. When working with younger generations on Bitcoin adoption and learning about it, is Gen Z more receptive than millennials or Gen Xers on that issue? And what difference do you see? What do Zoomers need to hear to get excited about Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I mean, as you mentioned, I co-founded an organization called Generation Bitcoin, which actually brought me into Bitcoin because I saw that, when entering the broader crypto space, and then, eventually the Bitcoin space, was that a lot of people thought it's for Zoomers, it's for, younger people. That's not true about the Bitcoin space at all, actually. It's more, if you were to get a medium on it, it would be more of like a millennium type. And I think the importance here of educating newer generations to this, even after Gen Z, Gen Alpha, people who, are increasingly digital, right? So like everything, all the communication that Gen Z does, whether it's texting, photos, everything is digital, and even money, right? Like using fintech app, using the Gen Z has not particularly like sent wires. There's not like these are technologies that we're leaving behind, and I think it relates back to the financial freedom use case of Bitcoin, to be able to protect your own sovereignty, and for next generations to be able to do that as well, because as everything is increasingly digital, and as you're kind of leaving your traces everywhere. It kind of puts you in a position where, do you want to use online money that can be censored, or do you want to use freedom money, which I believe is Bitcoin? And the development of CBDCs around this case as well is extremely frustrating for not only the whole population and younger generations that are now experiencing this, but also for freedom fighters and activists. And I'd like to share Lyudmyla's passion on this topic, is that CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, are such a gray area. But by our research right now, out of 193 governments, there's 127 that are actively deploying, piloting, and researching CBDCs. So this is about 2/3 of governments. And I think it's just a very big red flag that many Gen Zs are not aware of right now. And it's not that they're not receptive to Bitcoin, it's just the education sort of lacks in that field.
So Bitcoin in school curriculum?
Bitcoin in school curriculum, yeah.
Well, that sounds good to me. And I wanted, because we're getting towards the end of the time that we have, so Bitcoin coexists in a world, and we've discussed some of this, that sees the return of authoritarianism in the way that we probably thought that we had gotten rid of. And it tied to a reduction in personal liberty. At the meantime, Bitcoin has enabled this flexibility and connection and privacy and access that we also didn't have previously. So with those two things happening at the same time, do we think that Bitcoin can tip the scale towards more personal liberty? And let's start with you, Stella. If you had to, I'm asking you to make big predictions here, but ultimately, if we had to look to the future, how would you analyze that?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, these processes started almost at the same time, right? And partly in response to one another, where we were in 2010 when WikiLeaks started publishing the Chelsea Manning leaks. That was probably internet freedom at its height, and it's also when Bitcoin, started taking off maybe a bit early for that, but being used and being known more broadly. And I mean, back in I think it was 2011, Julian was explaining Bitcoin to the I think it was CEO Eric Schmidt of Google, and he had never heard of it before. But 2 years later, he was talking about it in conferences and so on. These trajectories are parallel and in conflict, and we need to fight because the censorship and the crackdown, and I think it's pretty meaningless to talk about authoritarian governments because Julian is in prison because the U.S. wants to put him on trial for 170. He's facing a sentence of 175 years. Like, if that's not authoritarian, what are we even talking about? Julian just published evidence of war crimes implicating the U.S., and the UK has been holding him in the highest security prison the UK has for 5+ years without conviction or sentence. I mean, this is as authoritarian as it gets. So this distinction, I think, is meaningless to my mind, and we're experiencing it, and we need to recognize it. It's happening right now, and all these regulations, they're so benign looking. It's like KYC, and then the banks are just like, trying to shed, responsibility or tick boxes and so on, and the effect is real, and it is on each and every one of our freedoms. And this process is just taking off, and we really need to form a robust culture and resistance to those tendencies, because they're just continuing and basically accelerating, and there has to be a counterbalance to that.
Same question to you, Arsh. Can Bitcoin tip the scale against authoritarianism?
You know, I think the distinction, as Stella mentioned, between authoritarian democracies, I think oftentimes these are just labels, because what's happening now is even in the most democratic countries, governments are actively gaslighting people when it comes to their finances, and they're typically portraying it in a way that, oh, it's for the best, it's convenient, it's easier. At least to our count right now, about 70% of the world lives under an authoritarian regime. But I think this Bitcoin applies for 100% of the world. And if I were to sort of leave the audience with like one mantra about it, is that a majority of the governments around the world need censorship, confiscation, and closed capital markets. Bitcoin offers the complete opposite. Bitcoin offers free speech, property rights, and open capital markets, but it's up to us to use it. We're going bottom up, grassroots, against top down, and if we don't defend our rights, we're going to lose them.
And in that final minute, Lyudmyla, I wanted to give you the last word there. So you have you have that remaining 50 seconds to.
Sure. So there are two aspects to remember. First of all, Bitcoin is going to scale. There's no other way. I strongly believe it is because we have to win. This is first thing. Second thing, power never is given. It's taken. And if we want to take it, we have to defend our developers who develop technology for us as a freedom technology, and also our Bitcoin miners and users and investors. These conditions to be implemented to scale. That's it. Thank you.
Oh. I thank all of our panelists for the conversation. Thank you so much to everyone in the audience. I see a lot of people in the room here, so thank you so much for being here with us, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Free Assange.
Thank you, guys.